We welcome you back to Let's Talk About, and we want to apologize for that break in transmission. And also to remind you that we are streaming live on the Facebook and YouTube pages of Trinity United Church, Legon. You can drop your comments, your questions, your contributions to the conversation as we have it on those respective pages. You can also send us a WhatsApp message on the number 0501 579996. The number again is 0501 579996. And I did indicate to you that my guests this evening are Professor Kofi Dakwa, who is a historian, having served as a lecturer at the University of Ghana and later, upon retirement, at the University of Education, Winneba. Also joining us this evening is Mrs. Felicia Dakwa, who is a trained and also practiced nurse and midwife. She also taught at the Kolebu College of Nursing and Midwifery, and eventually moving on to the University of Ghana Department for Nursing, now the School of Nursing and Midwifery. So once again, welcome to you, Prof. and Ma'am. So today we're looking at Tete Wobika, and I had asked early on what our national life was pre-colonization, but then the importance of explaining what Tete Wobika means, especially for those who do not understand the tree. Prof.
Okay. For the benefit of those who don't speak tree and don't understand it, Tete Wobika literally means the past has something to say. That's the very literal translation. The past has something to tell us. The past has lessons to give us. There was some time ago, way back in the past, a Roman lawyer, philosopher, statesman, who was called Marcus Tullius Cicero. And he made a statement, and I'd like to quote that statement for you. He said that those who don't know what happened before they were born remain forever children. In other words, if you don't know what happened in the past, you're like a child. Children don't know very much about anything.
Yeah.
And so it's important that people get to know what happened
In the past.
Or else, according to Cicero, they remain forever children.
Yeah.
Nobody, I'm sure, wants to remain forever
A child. Yes.
And so it's important that we learn something from the past, right? Now, for the benefit of this discussion, we will have to break the discussion into stages.
Yeah.
As a nation, as a motherland, we lived many centuries. And so we break this into centuries before the colonial period, and then we'll go on to look at life in this motherland during the colonial period, and then in the period after the colonial period, in other words, independence period.
Correct.
So there are three stages we're going to be talking about.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about all the things that happened in the past in each of these stages in this motherland. Now that, of course, is a very tall order.
It is.
Now, if we were doing this in a classroom in any university, it would probably take us about a whole semester.
Yeah.
But we have to compress all this into an hour, I believe.
Yes.
For the purpose of this discussion. So what that means is that we can't go into too many details.
Yeah.
And we'll have to skip some of the not so crucial issues and move fast. So let's start with the first stage, the period before the colonial period. That is to say, the pre-colonial period.
Yeah.
The period before the white man came here.
Yeah.
The period before we came into contact with the white man.
Yeah.
Right? Now, as you all know, this country has a number of ethnic groups living in it. By about the 15th century, when I say
the 1400s,
we're talking about 1400. Most of the people who now live in this country were already within the borders of this country.
Okay.
Now, the period from that year, about 1400, up to the 19th century, was a period in which the societies developed, you know, and built up their own cultures, governance, management, trade, politics, military systems, and so on.
Yeah.
And interacted with each other. All the people who now live in this country were already here by about the 15th century. And many of them lived in the areas where we find them now. Although between the 15th century and about the 18th century, there were movements, migrations. Internal migrations, movement as a result of military activities, as a result of shortage of land, growth in population, that kind of thing. Now, as a result of these activities, structures of governance developed, and societies built themselves up into kingdoms and states, and interacted among themselves, militarily, politically, and commercially. Because, you know, the terrain in which people live are different. And so they traded among themselves in the products of the area, traded in gold, traded in salt, traded in beads, traded in local products, and that kind of thing. And also they interacted militarily, because this state formation process involved a lot of military activities. The stronger societies, ethnic groups, took advantage and dealt with the weaker ones, and so on. The consequence was that a number of state systems developed in various parts of the country. In the forest regions, we had societies and state systems like Denchira, like Akwemu, and like Adansi. The very first of them, what is referred to as Akan PSA, developed in the Bono Techiman area.
Akan PSA in the Bono Techiman area, which is above the Denchira Adansi area.
Yeah, which is above there.
Okay.
So in the quasi savannah areas.
Yes.
And as a matter of fact, it was from there that most of the forest peoples moved down, settled in what is today the Adansi for a long time, which is where many of the features are developed.
Okay, so let's look at, and still within the pre-colonial period, and you've given us a beautiful picture of we have those in the forest regions, and then there must have been, of course, the coastal people as well, those who were the indigenes along the coast as well. What was significantly different amongst those who lived within the forest regions from those who lived in the coastal regions, especially along the lines of how they built their states and kingdoms, as well as their military prowess and their stock in trade, as these three are very key features that I hear you talk about?
But we must also remember that state systems didn't develop only in the forest and the coastal and coastal hinterland. In the far north,
Yes.
state systems also developed.
To the savannah regions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kingdoms like the Dagong, Dabong, the Mamprusi, the Nanumba, the Kokomba, Gonja, and so on. These formed state systems in the savannah belt. Now, to address your question, the forest area all the way down to the coast also developed state systems. By the time we're talking about, by the 15th, 16th century, some Europeans had already arrived at the coast.
We learned in social studies that the first Europeans came in 1471, the Portuguese.
That's within the 15th century.
Yes.
So we are within the time.
Yeah.
And they traded with the local people. And one of the things that happened was that they brought in firearms.
Okay.
You talk about military prowess and so on. So if you talk about what was significant militarily, those who had firearms were significantly superior than those who didn't. And all this impacted on the state formation processes and the territorial expansion and so on. And also impacted on the trade system. As a matter of fact, the trade was one of the crucial things that helped the state formation, right? So that was significant.
Okay.
The trade was in many items. The most important ones among the locals were salt, gold, and so on, right? And the peoples in the north had items that those in the south didn't have, which is cowries and so on, were also part of the trade items. And so that's what happened. And as a result of the trade among themselves, the local peoples, as well as over time with the Europeans who had come into the coastal area, wars and so on began. Began
amongst the states?
Among the states, because they needed to control the trade and participate in the trade with the Europeans, particularly the gold trade.
Okay.
You know, from the gold-bearing areas. That's how Denchira, for example, became important as a state, because the trade passed through the Denchira territories.
And for the benefit of those who are trying to connect, say, the Denchira to present-day Ghana, that sits somewhere within the central region.
That's correct.
Upper part of central region.
That is correct.
Okay.
In the area that today is Jokwa and
the like. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So that's part of central region.
Okay.
And the trade routes came down. Some trade also passed through the eastern part and came down to Accra.
Okay.
Right.
So which side of the eastern part? If we are looking at present-day Ghana?
Oh, through the eastern region.
Okay.
To Greater Accra region.
Okay.
And it's because of the trade that the Europeans who first arrived built what is today important tourist items.
The forts and castles.
The forts and the castles along the coast.
Okay.
Now, several European nations were involved. Remember, we're still in the pre-colonial period,
times,
right?
yeah.
Several European countries were involved. The Portuguese were involved. The Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes, the Germans, Brandenburgers,
The Dutch.
and the British.
British, of course.
And, you know, they themselves had to interact among themselves.
So there were interstate interactions where we are looking at the locals, and there was also international relations amongst the foreigners, and there was interstate and the foreigners interactions as well.
You see, look, the foreign companies
Yes.
that came to the coast
Yeah.
established their forts and their castles. They established relations with the local peoples. They supported them in their relationship with the hinterland people in terms of the coverage and the control of the trade items and the trade routes. And so in that sense, you are the whole medley of relationships developing. Now, that was to have a very important effect on the peoples eventually.
Yeah. And maybe just before you continue with the story, so what were they using as the medium of exchange?
Gold,
Gold.
cowries,
Okay.
imported items, beads, and things like that.
So there was a commodity exchange.
Yes, there was because currencies of the kind that we know today hadn't developed.
Okay.
Okay,
That's very
and so the kind of currencies that were being used were items of trade, you know, and cowries and so on.
Yeah.
Now, with time, the European forts and castles change hands. And eventually, the British came to control all the forts and the castles. Now, we mentioned earlier on that there were relationships between the Europeans who settled along the coast and the local people.
Yes.
Akwemu, for example, became an important factor in this thing, relationship. And in fact, at some point, Akwemu controlled the Christian War Castle.
That's in Accra.
Yeah.
Here in Osu.
So one of the chiefs conquered and mounted himself, established himself there, and so on. Along the central regions and the western regions, the forts and castles change hands. I mean, the what is called the notes, that is to say, the land and the permission for establishing the forts and castles change hands according to who controlled the area.
Okay.
Right? And that was extremely important for the local people. Because if you had the notes, if you had the control over the people at the coast and the castle people, then it means that you control the trade in that area.
I see.
You know, and that was one of the important things that helped the state formation and the conquest and military activities, which eventually led to the establishment of the kingdom and the empire of the Asante.
Asante.
Remember that I said that there were all kinds of state systems.
Yeah.
Asante was the last of the Akan state systems. And Asante was able to take advantage of the experiences and the treasures of the old kingdoms. And when they conquered, it became extremely important and rich and so on. So as a part of the process of state formation, military expansion, control of trade and trade routes, and all that, the Europeans gradually got involved with the Africans. And the British, when they took over, they attempted, to expand their control over these areas. And that's what led us into the beginnings
of the colonial
period.
So before we get into the colonial period, two important states you've mentioned in this. You spoke about in fact three. You spoke about the Dintra and how strong and powerful they were. And then you came to the Akwemus and how they were very dominant at a point in time. In fact, you mentioned one of them taking over the Christian Borg. Would that be Nana Ansa Sasreku?
That's correct.
So Nana Ansa Sasreku. And then the last of the Akan dominant kingdoms you are now talking about is the Asante. There's an interesting story about the Asantes that gets to be told. We want you to tell us a bit more how the name Asante came by.
I'm not on top of that.
Okay.
But if you have any ideas, share it with us.
Okay, so it's indicated that the Asante is actually a coinage from Asa Inti. Asa. That's from wars, because of wars. So what the Asa? Or they engaged in wars, and so they came together because of wars. Who did they come together to fight against? Who was that adversary that forced them to come together as different people to be able to fight?
Oh, the adversary was obviously Dintra.
Okay.
And you see, the people who came together were originally not united, right? They were little spots of ethnic Akans, right? And they were all controlled by Dintra, because Dintra was, at this point in time, a most powerful state. And all these other states were subject to Dintra. And the story is that the people who came together in the forest area, the people who eventually became known as Asante, as you explained, Esa Inti, they did so to fight against Dintra, because Dintra was sitting hard on them and making demands
Of them.
of tribute that was hard for them to fulfill.
I see.
And so they came together, they fought wars, and the Battle of Fiyasi, the crucial Battle of Fiyasi, 1701, beginning of the 18th century, turned the tide.
Okay.
The Asante, the group that came together, won the war, and so freed themselves from Dintra rule and became the dominant state system in the area, expanded the control over all the trade routes to the coast.
I see.
Time will not allow us to go into the details.
Yeah.
So we only will scratch the surface at this point.
Yeah.
And so by the middle of the 18th century, Asante expansion was taking place not only southwards, but also northwards, eastwards. And by the middle of the century, by the time of Upuku and his successors, Asante had established a strong, dominant empire.
Okay, so we'll be going for a quick commercial break, right? We're going for a quick, in fact, it's a musical break. But before we go, I mean, you had indicated these activities were leading us to the colonial era. If we can touch quickly on those activities which eventually led us into the colonial period.
You see, we had said that
Yes.
the Europeans in the forts and castles,
Yes.
in order to protect and expand their trade, had formed alliances with the local people.
Yes.
And the local peoples were having to relations with the interior, those in the coastal hinterland and those in the far interior regions.
Yeah.
The relations were not always friendly because there was competition to control the trade and the trade routes, which means that the various alliances found themselves in competition and in wars, right? Now, the British found themselves at war with the Asante, and several battles were fought between the British and the Asante people and the allies of the British along the coast and so on.
Which were the states who were in alliance with the British?
There were several of them. Some of the Fanti peoples were in alliance.
Okay.
Elmina was in alliance with Asante, I think, and the Gas and so on were also in alliance with
the British?
Yes, because they needed to protect themselves and defend themselves against the Asante and the control, and later on, somewhere along the line, even the Achims, who also built themselves into a fairly strong kingdom earlier on and drove away the Akwemu people from where they originally were.
Where were the Akwemus originally?
The Asamankasi area.
Okay.
The Asamankasi Akwetia area, all the way from there, Akwetia, Asamankasi, all the way. In fact, the area that today is occupied by the Achim people.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
That was originally.
And now the Akwemus are somewhere around the Akosombo area.
And so the Achim people gradually impinged on them and
push them away.
Pushed them across the Volta.
So where, in all of this, how were the northern territories involved?
Oh, the northern territories were doing their own thing.
Okay.
Fighting among themselves and so on, and building up the various state systems that developed in the north. Although we must add that it wasn't every state system, it wasn't every ethnic group in the north that was monarchical. That was monarchical.
Okay.
There were states that were not kingdoms. There were peoples who were not kingdoms, right? What is referred to as the acephalous societies. Societies which didn't have kings, but had social structures of different kinds.
Okay.
But surely there were also wars and so on in the north among the peoples, and also establishing their kingdoms and expanding and absorbing some of the weaker groups and so on.
Okay, how about the eastern side, now present day Volta region, Oti region, how were they involved in all of this?
Well, they were also forming their own state systems. They got involved, the coastal areas got involved with the trade. Asante went in there and fought.
Okay.
Piki was established. I mean, people in Piki were also involved in the wars. There were wars with the Asante people in the Volta region parts of the Volta region. And what is the Uti region?
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
What is the Uti region? Kitikrachi, for example, was established as a result of the wars, you know, and as you probably know, the people of Kitikrachi are Akan.
Yeah.
But
we learned the Agwans.
Well, look, the Guans were the autochthonous peoples of this area, right? And the Guans spread over several areas, but somehow the Guans were overtaken by the incoming ethnic groups.
Yeah.
And now the Guans are spread in little pockets in several parts of the various regions of this. Some of them are in the central region, the Futus, for example.
Yeah.
Some of them are in the eastern region.
Yes. The Chirpongs.
The Chirpongs, Blue, for example, Latte, and so on. Some of them are in Uti region, the Chumru, and so on and so on. But what that means is that the Chirpons who were the Guans who were the original inhabitants of these people, of this country, were taken over.
Yeah.
And now they are in small pockets.
Okay.
All over.
All right. So this still let's talk about, and today we are talking about Tete Wobika. The past has lessons for us, and we've been talking to Professor Kofi Dakwa, and you heard briefly Mrs. Felicia Dakwa coming through. When we come back, so far we'll be looking at the pre-colonial period. When we come back, we'll be looking at the colonial period and then the independence struggle, how we eventually transitioned into an independent country and how our lives have been subsequent to that. We take this quick musical break which tells us and calls us to action. This is Let's Talk About. We'll be right back. Out here with us on Trinity United Church Legon, on our Facebook as well as YouTube pages. Please send through your comments, your contributions, and we'll be happy to share them with the rest of the world. And just before we went for the break, we were talking about the life of the people of present-day Ghana pre the colonial period. Prof, let's go quickly into how we entered into colonization and how life was at that period.
We established by the 1870s, the British had taken over the trade of the whole area, of the coastal area, the forts and the castles, and had been involved in wars, partly as allies of the local people against the Asante and so on. And so by 1874, the British had taken over the whole of the area that is south of the Pra.
And that's 2 years before the setup of Infant Spim School.
If you like. 1874.
Yeah.
Right? The battles Sir Garnet Woolsey War.
The Sagranti War,
which is referred to by Ghanaians as the Sagranti War.
Yeah.
Sir Garnet Woolsey War.
Yeah.
So that meant that the British had established a control over that area. Area north of the Pra had not come under the British yet. It took some time before that happened. One of the reasons that brought that about was the still aggressive expansion of the British towards the north for trade purposes and so on. And then in 1901, there was a war fought between the British and the Asante. Now the background is that one of the governors at the coast, the British governors at the coast, made the unwise demand for the golden stool. And the Asante would not hand over the golden stool. Santua fought, organized the Asante to fight against the British, and the British won the war. So 1901, at the end of the Santua War, the British incorporated
Ashanti
us into the control system, established it as a protectorate, and with agents like George Eckham Ferguson working in the north on behalf, in areas north of Asante on behalf of the British. The British extended their control into what is today the northern provinces, the northern regions of Ghana. Northern region, Savannah region,
northeast,
northwest, northeast, and so on. Those northern regions, which before independence were all called the Northern Territories, right? With the capital at Tamale. And so 1902, they too were constituted into a republic, into a protectorate. And so by the end of 1902, you could say that the area from the coast through Asante through to the north had come under British control. Part of the Volta region was to come under British control after the First World War. But other parts of the Volta region, Uti region and so on, were already under the British.
So we are talking after 1918, thereabouts.
Yes.
Okay.
After the First World War.
Okay.
After the First World War, what used to be German territories east of the Volta were divided by the League of Nations and given to the French and the British as mandated territories.
So League of Nations, that would be present-day United Nations?
No, not present-day, successor.
So, okay, the UN succeeded the League of Nations.
Yeah, became a successor to
the League of
because the League of Nations was a world body that was established after the First World War. It had its own problems, and it couldn't keep the world peace. And because it couldn't keep the world peace, we had the Second World War.
Okay.
And the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War, the United Nations was established to keep the world peace.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So far, it's been reasonably successful.
Okay.
Not that there hasn't been a world war,
Yeah.
but there have been areas of warfare all around.
Yes, of course. Of course.
But to come back
Yes.
to our country, so by 1919, 20, 21, more or less, the area that now is called Ghana had taken the form and the shape that we find today.
And it was called the Gold Coast.
It was called the Gold Coast.
When did that christening happen? Gold Coast.
Which christening?
The Gold Coast.
The
as
Gold
we're
Coast
called.
started with the Portuguese. When the Portuguese first arrived at the coast Albina in 1471, they found that it was a rich gold area.
Okay.
And so the Portuguese gave the name
Gold Coast. Okay.
to the area.
Okay. Okay.
The same way that they gave the name Ivory Coast
Okay.
to the country to the east, because when they got there, they found lots of elephants and ivory.
Okay.
So that's how it happened.
Interesting. Okay. So now we know how we became a colony of the British. And how was life different as a British colony from the previous period before we came under the colonial period?
Well, before we came under the colonial period, we governed ourselves. We were under the leadership of our own leaders. You know, we had our own leaders, our kings, our chiefs, and so on. Now, when we came under the British established the structures of governance over us. And so they established the Legislative Assembly, the Executive Council, instruments of their governance, the Judicial Service, and things like that. You know, by roughly 1890, all the instruments of administration, the tools for governance, the structures of administration had been established. And they used these instruments to introduce their policies, to take advantage of their conquest and their presence in the area.
So
They
was
introduced-
it maybe during the colonial period that they set up the court systems and all of that?
They set up the court system, the Supreme Court, the judiciary was established around 1874. The Legislative Assembly, Executive Assembly, the Executive Council about that time, 1874. And then they introduced a policy that enabled them to control the Africans, the Native Jurisdiction Ordinance of 1882.
Yeah.
Revised, of course, subsequently in 1927.
Okay.
So by the beginning of the 20th century, by 1900, the British were firmly, more or less, in control of this country.
Okay.
And the policies that they pursued, political policies, economic policies, social policies, all these impacted on the local people, positively and negatively as well.
Okay.
And it is, they introduce all kinds of measures. Their development, what you might call, if you like, developmental policies. They built roads, they built railways, they established mines. You won't call that development, you call that exploitative, right?
Yes.
Right. The mines, the timber industry and so on.
Yeah.
And in order to enable them to exploit
Yes.
these resources, they build the roads and the railways.
For transport, to be able to transport them.
Yeah, to make it possible for them to transport these resources
to the ports.
For export.
Okay.
Now, they also control the local trade. And British companies were involved, and other European companies were involved in the export and import trade. Now, all this benefited the Europeans and disadvantaged the Africans. We didn't touch on the slave trade.
Yes.
But the slave trade was also one of the major factors that drew the Europeans into contact with Africa, with Gold Coast. And the trade went on from the 1650s all the way up to the 19th century. Even when it was abolished, there was surreptitious engagement in trade for a long time. And the slave trade had its major problems for this country. And of course, the rest of Africa. The rest of it, you know. The diaspora people.
Yeah.
Now, though, we will say there's a sense in which this country is capitalizing on the diaspora thing in terms of the return to Africa.
Yes.
And so, but the slave trade was one of the major issues that enabled the British and the Europeans in general to
conquer the African continent.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure questions will come about the slave trade.
Yes. So
because we can only the time.
Yes, the time does not allow. Yes. So now we are at a point where it has been established that the British are controlling the colony. They're
controlling the whole country.
In fact, the entire country. They had brought it together and has firm control over it. Now we have a situation where, as you indicated, they were benefiting from whatever arrangement to the disadvantage of the locals. What were the things that precipitated that call for liberation from the British? I mean, because we are learning Ghana was actually the first suburb of the Sahara to have its independence. What were the main things that drove the locals to ask for independence?
Well, we'll have to go back even before the the period you're talking about. Remember that when the British attempted to conquer this area, the local people did not sit down and fold their arms. No, they resisted. Because no one wants to lose their independence. And so the local people responded to the British activities with resistance. And of course, you do know that some of the local chiefs who opposed this were arrested and deported to Lagos, to Sierra Leone, and so on. That was the beginning of what you might describe as nationalism. These early chiefs who opposed the attempt by the British to take over their country, and also the Aborigines Right Protection Society, which was an organization formed by the educated people in the coastal area, particularly from the Cape Coast region, resisted the policies
of the British.
And so that's where the beginning of the fight for independence That's how
That's
it
how
dates
we began.
back.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, let me come to you, Auntie Felicia. And now we are in a realm where you actually lived and you experienced. And, you know, we left this to this point for a reason. Living in pre-independent Ghana, I mean, what was the experience like? Life within that? I mean, you were born into it, but what were some of the issues that growing up during that era you saw and you were told about, which eventually led to the local people wanting to be free from British rule?
Well,
People had always been wanting to-
Yes, yes.
in the rural areas,
Yeah.
they live their lives going to the farm to be able to put something on the table.
Okay.
And then this bit of abrofo, and of course schools were started, and then you had Yebeji Fahudi. You hear about the Big Six,
Okay.
and they are trying to get us out of the grips of Abrofo. And so it was all exciting. And then in the process, you hear about, having talked about the Big Six,
Yeah.
Kwame Nkrumah being brought in to come and help. So he wasn't the person who brought in independence.
It has
It
started
had
from
started from by the Big Six. If we look on our currency here,
Yes.
we see the Big Six. Yes. And I dare say that Nana Akufo-Addo's relatives, 3 of his relatives
Yeah.
are within the Big Six.
Yes.
His father, his uncle, Pauli,
Yes.
and some other person,
JB Dankwa.
J.B. Dankwa. And
And then of course we had Akweji.
Akwaji brought in is, and Kwame Nkrumah. So it was exciting now to think about, oh, Yebinya Fahudi, Yebinya Fahudi. And I remember in 1957, I was in my 3rd year in nursing training school at Akwetia.
1957.
57.
You were in 3rd year
In 3rd
nursing
year,
training.
yes. And this was a hospital built and managed by a diamond company, CAST, Consolidated African Selection Trust
Okay.
Limited. And I remember when, as part of the activities of the independence celebration, this particular company organized activities including sporting activity, and I was very happy to participate in sporting activity, and I won a prize because I came first in the 100 meter.
That's right.
Yes.
So you're a sprinter.
Yes, I was. I was. And so things went on. We gained independence. At that time, the youth were more, how do I put it? What's the word now? Is it? We listen to what mommy and daddy will say,
Okay.
or what the big teacher, the school teacher would say. So we were more, or they were more obedient compared to what is happening around now.
They were more submissive.
Very submissive and obedient. And morally also would take good care of themselves. I'm thinking now towards as a nurse and a midwife. Interaction between young people, male, females.
Okay.
And I will bring you into my area as health.
Yes.
And every country's health system is assessed by the number of women who pass away as a result of pregnancy and its related complications.
Okay.
And hospitals were built. Now we have more hospitals than we did. Now we have more nurses and midwives than we did. But still, this area is one that I am so very, very disheartened about. High maternal deaths.
Mortality.
Women losing their lives as a result of trying to do what they were brought into this world. God said, come have children. And they are doing what is expected of them. And they are not being taken care of as well as should be, because in this same environment or through this same activity, in other areas, you have only, say, about 2, 3, 5 women out of, say, 1,000 losing their lives as a result of pregnancy and its related complications. And here in Ghana, sometimes they will talk about 350, but it is not. If you sat down, you can have 700 and plus. And it is something that worries my heart, because I have been a victim of that.
I see.
And
so when it comes to the space of health, you are now contrasting then and now.
Yes.
You think we've not done so great as a nation?
As a nation.
Okay.
We have tried.
Yes.
Because we have more nursing schools, midwifery schools. Even now we have medical schools. Yes. Maybe more than 2 medical schools. But this problem that I'm talking about, maternal mortality, we don't seem to be doing
well in respect of same. Okay, and I'll come back on that. But now,
I think we need to contextualize all that.
Okay,
right. We talked about the European administration and its policies in this country.
That's correct.
There were political policies we talked about, administrative control and so on of the people, about which the people were not happy.
Yeah.
They tried to get a part in the governance of their people, their own country. So, politically and administratively, the local people were not very happy. The British colonial system also had its social policies.
Okay.
Education and health, which is talking about, right? Now, hospitals were built, the schools were built, but in fact, the schools were built not by the government, but by the missionary institutions.
So you're saying education came not necessarily from the government, but from the Christian community?
That's what I'm saying. Look, if you take the census, if you take the statistics, the missionaries established a lot of schools in this country.
Yes.
And government schools were only a few at the primary level. And the secondary school, the secondary education level, the best schools in this country were established by the missionaries.
That's correct.
Indeed, the government itself established secondary schools only in the 1920s. The first of it is Achimota School.
Achimota.
Right. During the governorship of Governor Gogisbeck,
Yes.
that's when the social policy began to expand. That's when Achimota School was built.
Yeah.
But government took interest in the education that was being developed by the missionaries by controlling, establishing policies and guidelines for the education. Given the population and the spread of these social policies didn't go far enough, right? And the people were simply not satisfied.
Yeah.
In some, we would say that the political administrative policies, the social policies, the economic policies of the colonial government created a situation of dissatisfaction for the local people, and that is what led to resistance, the beginnings of the modern nationalist and struggle for freedom.
Okay.
We mentioned that the struggle for freedom started even when the British were trying to establish themselves.
Yeah.
They didn't succeed. What we might describe as the early nationalists, the chiefs, the local leaders, the Aborigines Rights Protection Society, they didn't succeed. In the 1920s, the nationalist fervor continued. The educated people took the leadership. The National Council for British West Africa, which was really established by a Ghanaian, Kisley Hayford, took over, in the 20s. In the 1930s and the 1940s, the youth movement, the youth of the country became increasingly politicized, increasingly dynamic, and also joined the struggle, So there was a ferment of nationalism during the 20s, the 30s, and all this was in response to the colonial administrative and social and economic policies. Right? That is what brought us closer to the present. By the 1940s, a new breed of leaders had emerged. Some were chiefs, but in general, they were the educated lawyers. The young, educated people. Not all of them were lawyers. The teachers, the catechists. When we talk about the youth, we're talking about the middle-level educated people. Who also felt the brunt of the colonial administration and its policies. And all of them served as a tinder for the leadership to canalize into an organized resistance.
And we were learning even some market women were very instrumental in all of this.
Women, not just market women.
Especially on a day like this that we are celebrating women.
Women also joined in the struggle because they too were affected by the colonial policy. She talks about the mining industry. these were all European controlled. And although, look at Obuasi. Obuasi had been mining gold for God knows how long. But look at the state of the Obuasi. Obuasi mined gold, I think, before Johannesburg. But go and look at how Johannesburg is like. So these were the things that irritated the local peoples and, you know, radicalized them. And so the leaders were able to take advantage of their radicalism and canalize them into a mass of opposition to lead into the independence struggle.
And that's how we now, eventually crossed that bridge.
You see, because of lack of time and because of the, we're skipping quite a few of the details. One of the things that the local people wanted the most was participation in governance, right? The educated people wanted participation. Of course, the Legislative Council and the Executive Council made some minor provision for the representation. But the more representation they got, the more they asked for more, you know. And so, because they were not giving enough, the Africans wanted to establish a situation where they would get more and more and more. And so they reacted to some of the difficulties, economic difficulties that came after the war. And the general economic depression in the world in the 1920s and the 1930s. And this is what really brought the youth into the system.
To be involved in all of this,
By the time the war was over, 1940s, the local educated elite had organized themselves, things had become political, and so they responded also politically. So they organized themselves into political parties. The first was the UGCC, formed in August 1947. It is by the educated lawyers, the Dankwas of this world, the Pawulis of this world, the and the others, you know,
Akwaje
and Obisebilamte and
Edward Akufo-Addo
and the old Akufo-Addo, not
the current one,
not Nana Akufo-Addo.
So the story gets more and more interesting, and I'm sure production is looking at this, and we may have to do a part 2 so that we can complete the story, God willing, next week. So, but unfortunately, because of our time, we'll need to wrap up. And I'm sure if you have been listening and watching us, you want to know more. But before we go, there are a few things we'll let both Auntie Felicia and then Prof address. But a question is coming through directly at you, Prof, or directly to you. Richmond is asking, what name did Ghana have before the Portuguese named it the Gold Coast in the 15th century?
Before the Portuguese named it the Gold Coast, it didn't have one single name.
Exactly.
As far as I know.
Exactly. So because we were not that together,
organized together as
to be
one
identified
nation.
as one nation. Indeed. Yes. Auntie Felicia, you wanted to add something briefly.
I wanted to salute Yas Santua because today is
International Women's Day.
Yes. And for her as a woman in 1900 to stand against the British and say enough is enough.
Exactly.
You know, yes. So all women, congratulations.
Great.
Especially to our mother, Yas Santua, who started the race
the fight for women. And I don't think we could have ended on a better note. I mean, it's International Women's Day, and from all of us here, with the media team of the Trinity United Church Legon, we want to celebrate our mothers, our sisters, the daughters, the friends, wives, all women, and we say, God richly bless you, and may you continue to shine in your respective endeavors as excellent women, spiritual, capable, intelligent, and virtuous. And we want to thank you so much for making time to join us this evening on Let's Talk About. We've been talking Tete Wobika, and we've been talking to Professor Kofi Dakwa, who is a historian, and Mrs. Felicia Dakwa, who is a retired nurse and midwife, and she's giving you that beautiful wave. My name is Benjamin Ofeado. I've been your host, and on behalf of the entire production team, we thank you so much for making time to join us. Do have yourself a good night, and meet us same time next week.